The road of glucose. Today we're going to talk about something that we all do, eat. But not just eating, more of how we process those things that we put into our bodies. It's mostly the same for everyone unless you have a certain disorder that makes it more difficult for you. But let me stop myself here before I get ahead of myself. Let's first talk about some of the foods that we eat. We all love those sweets, right? All that chocolate, the cake, the pies, the watermelon and the oranges, and well, you get my point. But have you thought about what happens to these sugars when it's inside your body? That's exactly what we're going to talk about today. Why should I care about what happens to sugar in my body, you might ask? Well, sugar, or glucose as we'll call it from here on out, is used by all the cells in your body as a source of energy. So it's pretty important. Now that we're talking about the energy of cells, let's get to know more about the actual cell itself. As you may all know, we are made of millions of cells. These cells have different types of transporters that are used for various reasons, such as bringing nutrients into the cell. Each transporter has a different purpose. Glucose has its own transporter. These transporters are called glucose uniporters, or GLUTs for short. A uniporter is a transporter that is able to transport only one molecule at a time. So, as the name suggests, GLUTs are able to transport only one glucose molecule at a time. You can think of the GLUT as a tunnel with a toll booth into the cell. The tunnel is closed off from all angles except one, so there is only one way to get into the cell. So let's think about the glucose molecule as a glucose truck, and only the glucose trucks are able to get into the cell. The purpose of the toll booth on this tunnel is to allow only one glucose truck into the cell at a time. There are different types of GLUTs for different cells. There are a total of 13 GLUTs, but let's just talk about 4 of the major ones today. The GLUTs are saturable, which means that they're only able to take in a certain amount of glucose molecules until they get full. Once they get full, some of them can go backwards and spit the glucose back out. There is also a different glucose transporter in the cells of your digestive tract. These are called SGLT1s, also known as sodium glucose transporters. These are the one-way tunnels for glucose trucks going from your digestive tract into your cells and eventually into your bloodstream. Now let's go through some of the glucose transporters here. So let's start with SGLT1, since this is where glucose starts making its way into our bloodstream. SGLT1 is a specific type of glucose transporter that is present in the epithelial cells of the intestines and the kidneys. The SGLT1 is different from the GLUTs because it is a symporter, whereas the GLUTs are a uniporter. In other words, it transports 2 different molecules at the same time. In this case, SGLT1 transports a glucose and 2 sodium molecules simultaneously. So, using our analogy here, you can think of the SGLT1 transportation as having a glucose truck and 2 sodium cars helping each other into the tunnel to go into the cell. Now that we've covered the beginning of glucose transportation into our bloodstream, let's move on to the movement of glucose from our bloodstream into our cells. Let's start the GLUTs off with GLUT1, which is found in basically every cell in the body. It's almost full at rest because it takes up glucose at a fast rate. The glucose that the GLUT1 takes in is used by the cell as energy, and it is not stored. So, GLUT1 would be the tunnel into the cell that exists in almost every cell. It'll have a little tow booth, just like all the other GLUTs, because it's going to let in only one glucose truck into the cell at a time. Next, let's talk about GLUT3. GLUT3 is only present in the brain, more specifically, the neurons in the brain. GLUT3 gets full fast because GLUT3 has a high affinity to glucose. In other words, it attracts the glucose molecules more greatly than the other GLUTs do. So, GLUT3 would be the tunnel that gets a lot of traffic from the glucose trucks because GLUT3 is more attractive due to the magnet pulling the trucks in. Next would be our GLUT2s. GLUT2 is located in the cells of the liver and pancreas, and more specifically, the pancreatic beta cells. The GLUT2s are only active when glucose levels are high. GLUT2 would be the tunnels with the toll booths that open when traffic is high. They'll let the glucose trucks into the cell until traffic has died down. GLUT4s are located in the muscle and adipose or fat cells. It's used mainly for the storage of glucose and is not always present. But when it is present, it has a high attraction for glucose. So then, how does the GLUT4 become present, you might ask? Well, the pancreas is able to send out insulin from the pancreatic cells to the muscle and fat cells. We'll call the insulin carts from here on out. And once the insulin carts reach the fat and muscle cells, they'll quickly cause the building of the GLUT4 tunnels. Once the trucks go through the GLUT4 tunnel, they become stored at the glucose storage center until they are needed at a later time. And with that covers all the 4 major GLUTs. Now that you know what happens to sugar in your body, let's more specifically talk about the food and what it does to your blood sugar. The glycemic index of food is how much the glucose levels in your body will rise over time when you eat a certain food. Different foods will have different glycemic indexes. Now, it's important to note here that glycemic index does not take into account the serving size of the food you are eating. Instead, it looks at how much the same amount of sugar in different foods will affect your blood sugar. It is known that foods with a low glycemic index are healthier for you because they do not cause a sudden rise in blood glucose levels. A low glycemic index will cause less insulin to be secreted into your bloodstream and cause less of a rebound effect, which we'll go into more later. Now that you have all this information, you're probably wondering how they all relate back to the GLUTs. Well, to start off, the glycemic index directly affects the GLUTs because the glycemic index affects how fast or slow the blood glucose levels rise. If there is a sudden high rise in blood glucose levels, it will be taken in by SGLT1, GLUT1, and GLUT3. As for GLUT2, it will, of course, take in glucose if the blood glucose levels are high. But the cells in the pancreas will also signal for the secretion of insulin, which then would cause the expression of GLUT4. GLUT4 will then cause the rapid intake of glucose into the muscle and fat cells for storage. And this would be bad, mostly because it would eventually cause a drop in your blood glucose levels below the normal, and this will cause the rebound effect, as we previously mentioned. The rebound effect will cause you to become hungry sooner rather than later. On the other hand, a low glycemic index will allow less secretion of insulin, and all the GLUTs will be able to take in the glucose provided steadily without dropping the blood glucose level below the normal. Now let's look at an example here. Watermelon, as you all may know, is very sweet and watery. So if we look at the glycemic index of watermelon, it's 76, which is relatively high. But why does no one ever say that watermelon is bad for you when it has such a high glycemic index? Well, look at it this way. Watermelon is made up of mostly water, and it's not really densely packed with sugar. And knowing that only the amount of sugar you are eating is taken into account for the glycemic index, you'll more than likely have to eat a lot of it to take in that amount of sugar. Let me give you another example here. Let's compare watermelons to cupcakes. If you take a bite out of a watermelon, you'll get, let's say, 90% water and 10% sugar. On the other hand, if you take a bite out of a cupcake, you'll more than likely get way more than 10% of sugar in that one bite. So, although the glycemic index of watermelon is high, it's not as densely packed with sugar. And this is why people say that watermelon is not bad for you. And now you know more about the GLUTs and how different foods affect your blood glucose levels. And more importantly, the role of glucose in your body. And on that note, I'll leave you with this knowledge, and I hope that you'll use it to your advantage. And thank you for listening. All the information and knowledge about the GLUTs and glycemic indexes have been obtained from Dr. Wilk's class and notes. More knowledge about the glycemic index have been obtained from the following source: